many people I want to turn to right away on some of the points you just made, but I want to pick up with this final question and turn to Eli Pariser. This notion that in less than a year, in the course of a year, that Democratic leaning, that Democratic attraction has taken a dramatic hit. Does that square with your understanding of what's happened, what you see and feel out there among grassroots supporters of Move On?
Well, I would say that
among young people.
And I was thinking about this for this panel because I think I'm 14 days short of being a millennial, actually. 1980, December 17th.
They'll probably let you in.
Yeah,
sure. Honorary.
I'm knocking on the door. So, among, and Move On actually, over the course of 2008, added about 2 million new members, many of whom were young, many of whom were millennials. My main thought on this actually goes to something that I think you wrote recently about the kind of malleable, movable.
Just going to steal my points now?
Yeah, no.
What am I going to say? What am I going to talk about?
This is remix culture, Matt.
Right.
You know, the fact that I think history will show, but I'm not sure that the kind of allegiance to brands as a lifelong commitment in general is as true of this group as of previous groups. I think I would expect to see more variance, and 2008 as a high point, but a lot of variance in real time as people are adjusting to a very quickly changing world, and that kind of flexibility, I think, is a characteristic of this group. So I don't think that. I think there's something real happening there. I also think that it's less. It may be less significant than it looks when you're looking at other generations that change much more slowly.
From the other perspective, Rehan, from the perspective of conservatives, Republicans, whatever in the label, whether you call it, Republican, conservative, or what, it improved. The picture improved, but as we just heard Michael say, there's still this reluctance to happily attach the label. Of Republican. It's leaning.
Funny story. So the term that we use, conservatism, to describe this political tendency, Bill Buckley, when he wrote God and Man at Yale, called it individualism. And then later on, someone gave it the name conservatism to associate it with this kind of older American tradition. But the name was a little arbitrary in a way. And you see a lot of folks who call themselves progressives now who would have called themselves liberals in another generation. When you look at Democratic identifiers circa the 1960s, think about what that meant. What that meant if you were living in the Deep South and you were identifying as a member of the Democratic Party, or were you in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party? It means a lot of different things. So we look at these seemingly stable categories over a long period of time, and they're useful, they're helpful in some ways. They describe certain things usefully and other things less usefully. But I think that the thing is, these categories actually are quite unstable. They mean different things at different times. And I think that that's the thing that I think of as most distinctive about this moment and also about this generation. So you can have someone who described themselves as a Democrat, as a diehard Democrat in 1974, Watergate baby, someone who kind of looked at the world in that particular way. Then when they were voting, for Bill Clinton in 1992, this person was perhaps in a very different class position. They had a different mix of issues that they cared about, et cetera. And they lived in a different part of the country. So I think that that's one thing to keep in mind. I think that when you're looking at these kind of broad contours of American ideological change, we talked about social liberalism and social conservatism, and about how that's changed over time. Well, you have lots of dispute about, for example, views on abortion and a lot of other little things like that. One thing that you see, though, is that this generation considers those social issues somewhat less politically salient. They're less intense voting issues than they were for somewhat older folks. And then also another thing to think about is, are you a social liberal or a social conservative if you embrace the views of everyone who's around you, your family, everyone in your neighborhood, everyone who is, kind of shares your broad sensibility? So what kind of impulse is that? We call that liberal because that way you're both a liberal if you live in Austin, Texas, or Sugar Land, Texas, if you have these particular sets of views. But in terms of your sensibility, the way that you approach the world, the way that you think about things, are you someone who actually breaks the mold? Are you someone who is a contrarian by nature? it actually doesn't tell you all that much. And I think that when you're looking at our politics right now, I think that the really interesting comparison is to a moment like the late 60s. You saw a magazine like The Public Interest, and there was Bill Kristol, and there was Daniel Bell, and then there was Charles Reich. Charles Reich then wrote The Greening of America and became a kind of hero to the hippies. And then Bill Kristol became a kind of avid defender of Nixon. You have this moment of incredible political discontinuity right now. And so I can't tell you what's going to happen to these different partisan identifiers or what have you. What I can tell you is that realignments ain't what they used to be. You used to see a realignment, and it would last for a long period of time, and now things seem to be moving a lot faster. This is a kind of view that Matt has raised, among others.
Now there's really nothing left from that.
I'm sorry. So I just kind of caution us to kind of think a little bit about kind of what these categories mean, how they're shifting. When I think of Move On, I think of a group that actually is a funny mix of things. It's a civil society group that is partisan in some respects, but it's also a group that's not. It's a different kind of special interest group. And I think that they're very explicit about that. And then when you look at what's happening in the Tea Party movement, how do these guys feel about an issue like Afghanistan? How are they going to feel about an issue like that 6 months from now? If you think you know the answer to that, then you know a heck of a lot more than I do. But
All right, Matt, we're going to finally let you have a word here.
Let me just. That was exceptionally insightful on this, I think. But when we talk about generational change, I'm not a social scientist, so just looking at it from the sort of dumbed down perspective of journalism. When you talk about generational change, right, it's not actually where you, and I'm sure you guys would agree with me, it's not a flip of a switch. If you're 20 to 32, you're in this category, and you're 33. It happens very gradually, and it permeates those boundaries. So I would submit that this president, right, is actually on the leading edge. He's a few years older than I am. He just makes the boom, but nobody really would put him in that category, right? He's on the leading edge of a much broader generational shift happening in the country that, as you filter down to what we're calling millennials, is much more distilled and apparent, but is really happening from a much older age level down. And it can be looked at, as having a variety. It can be looked at as having a variety of characteristics. I think the defining characteristic of that generational change, and it's social and it's cultural and it's technological, is this breakdown of loyalty to institutions, generally, because this probably has its roots in the Watergate period, right, and in the questioning of government generally, which brought a lot of boomers and people just older than the boomers, like President Obama, into political consciousness. We see it's probably affected by scandals in trusted institutions like steroids in baseball or the Catholic Church, the failure of companies like General Motors, the failure of the banks, and it's certainly technological in the sense that. You don't. The internet has really broken down institutional hegemony. I mean, I just went and got a mortgage for another house. I mean, you don't go to the bank. You go online. It took me 5 minutes to compare all the rates. Some guy called me up right away, and you start the process. I mean, Daniel Pink, the writer, has called us free agent nation. I think that's a great term. I would actually say we're a nation of comparative shoppers in a sense. I mean, that is the ethos of this generation and the generations to a certain extent that are older. So anybody who lives their lives online. So as you point out, what that means is that that's going to obviously translate to party loyalty. It means that while you can ask people what their party identification is, and as you point out, they're going to mostly be independent, and then you kind of nudge them ever so gently into a camp, you can't really figure out how their view of identification to a party is different from somebody else's. And I think just based on their attitudes about institutions, they are going to be. It's not surprising to me at all that you would lose 8 points in a quarter or whatever it is, because they're going to move around. I think they really liked Obama a lot. I think they will identify with personalities. I think the opposite was true with Bush. I think they are repelled by personalities. But whether or not that creates an institutional loyalty, I think it probably does not. And so I do think we're going to have, as Raheem says, a faster movement of realignments. And it's why Democrats who are shocked now say, wow, we had this 40-year realignment going in 2008. It was all set. And I remember doing panels like this one where people said, we're going to have a 40-year, this is a Rooseveltian realignment. And 2 years later, they can't understand how they're battling to keep the House. It should show you the stupidity of making grand pronouncements. Because in fact, our realignments aren't going to be 40 years. They're going to be 40 months if you're super lucky, maybe 40 days, maybe 40 minutes, depending on what's happening on cable news.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, let me speak to
Eli.
One other piece of, I think, what's going on here, which is I think this is a generation, we are a generation, tuned into form and as well as content. So, participation in institutions, in ideas, in political life is actually kind of baked into the structures that we're familiar with. Before I went on this, yesterday I posted to my Facebook page, what should I say on the panel at the Millennials conference, and I got like 30 comments, so I don't have to actually do any thinking. But and one of them was about this thing about that part of what's going on is the Obama campaign was a forum that was very familiar to these people. It was an open forum. You could go on, you could form groups, you could find other people. This looks a lot like Facebook. It feels like the kind of stuff we know. The Obama government has had trouble creating a form of government that feels as participatory as as the campaign was for many of us who were part of it.
So all the government needs to do is all the White House is become an extension of Facebook.
That's right. I think Facebook, White House, and actually they are trying to do this, and I think it does change. Barack Obama appears in my friend feed every 6 days and has a little pronouncement or something, and it's interesting. It's not quite right because I think the other piece is about authenticity. And I know that that's some person in the DNC typing that in, and not actually the president. But but that does. But actually, in some ways, false authenticity is worse than no than just staying out of those spaces.
Scott and Michael, help us dig a little bit deeper into what was this attachment to Obama and the Democrats in 2008 all about? How much of it was the person and the Facebook manifestation, whatever, and how much of it was something deeper or longer lasting?
I think the points that have been made about the way in which the campaign was run, speaking to the way in which young people were thinking and interacting, are very good ones. And so in that sense, I think there was something special about Obama, if not personally, about the way he ran the campaign, that made young people a more important part of the campaign effort than it might have been had Hillary Clinton prevailed. But I'm also a fairly strong believer that based on the value profiles and the issue attitudes that we saw, attitudes about the wars and so forth, that Hillary Clinton would have done about as well as Obama did in terms of the split of the vote. But in terms of the energy that was put behind the campaign, that may have depended partly on the personality of Obama and who he was as a person, and also upon the way in which he ran the campaign.
You think she would have done as well as he did among younger voters?
I think it would have been very similar, simply because we saw 60% of them vote for Democratic candidates in the House races in 2006. And sure, there were plenty of charismatic candidates, but there were probably plenty that were not. And they, young people disproportionately gave their votes to the Democrats.
I think what a lot of people are interested in is getting at what is the sticky part of that, for the Democrats. What is it that young people can be counted on to continue to like about what they see Democrats doing, and what is it that Republicans can come in, and whether they're leaning Republican or whatever, can come in and hope to pick off? Who wants to explore that a little bit?
One thought is that we kind of have this funny situation in which we have two conservative parties right now in the United States. And by that I mean conservative in terms of sensibility. You saw this year the Republicans do something that ironically a lot of so-called Republican reformers advocated for a long time, which is you saw the party respond to their constituency, and their constituency is old. They're white. And if you're looking at incumbent legislators who want to win re-election, they were very keenly aware of the fact that they feel very strongly about Medicare. Now, the same exact kind of trimming of the growth of Medicare that Republicans pursued in the 1990s as a way of financing tax cuts and a variety of other measures were pretty strongly attacked. It became a bedrock principle. Jim DeMint, the great tribune of the Tea Party movement, has explicitly said that protecting our, kind of the agreement, the pledge that we made to seniors is vitally important. So you have this one political party that, given its demographic balance, is racked by this kind of deep contradiction. And then you have another political party that is conservative in a subtly different but also important sense. The Democrats are very interested in kind of minimizing the kind of economic pain that you're seeing over the course of this recession for lots of good and complicated reasons. Whereas in the early 1980s, Reagan, who many people compare Obama to, made this very different deal. Reagan and Volcker basically, kind of engineered an incredibly punishing recession that led to liquidation of a lot of sectors, et cetera. This is a very different thing. But that was an era when you had lots of Americans who remember the Depression, or who remembered what we forget now, which is that in that early part of the 50s or right after the war, there was a huge it was a very different period of some privation, tremendous anxiety, and a sense that, this is something that can happen. And now we're in this era of the great moderation. The Millennial Generation hasn't experienced a wrenching recession. This is what it is to them. And so I think that creates a kind of affluence trap, in which actually some of the things that we want to see in terms of real transformative change, whether you're on the far left or the far right, actually are just not possible. People have too much to give up right now, particularly people who are under 30, who kind of have no real subjective experience of what really wrenching economic change is like. And I think that is actually a big player in how our politics will likely play out. And it's one reason why it's not the filibuster or something like that. I think that's the reason why really big ticket dramatic reforms are just going to be very hard and will only happen when there's a perception of real exigency.
And Matt Bai, how disillusioning is that to young people who, whether you put them high or low on a scale of idealism?
I had to think about this, looking at the numbers and having read the report before, is you all do about as much as you can do to try and put the generations in context to one another. But, the truth is, young Americans have been liberal since, the first caveman started an anti-spear campaign. And they've been disillusioned since that time as well. And this is like a hallmark.
But isn't this one more liberal than other generations were? I'm asking. I don't know. Is that true, Scott?
It's a little hard to say. I mean, as I said, in 1974, boomers were extremely democratic, certainly. Even back in the 50s, the silent generation leaned very heavily Democratic, more so than today. So there is some sign that there's that. And the Xers, in some way, are the outlier in all of that. Even when Xers were in their teens and early 20s, they were coming of age in that late Reagan era where things looked good. We had won the Cold War. The economy had come back from those early recessions. And that imprint has really stuck with that generation. So it's not a universal, but I think it does.
You certainly have to put it in when you put it in relation to where the society is on a lot of these attitudes, right? It certainly it may be constant. But I do think this point about the economic situation is very interesting. You guys pointed out in the numbers early on the attitudes toward banks and business hadn't changed. I noticed another number in your report about millennials feeling actually quite confident about their economic futures. What was it? Something like 9 in 10 who thought they were at some point at least going to have enough money to do the things they want to do. I once, Gary Hart, who I've spent some time talking to for my next book, told me once that he thought in his worst moments he feared it would take a depression to change the political dynamic that Raheem was talking about, where we could get sort of broad changes to updating and changes to our social contract, to our slate of policies. He may be right, and if he is, I think this is why we're understanding now that this recession, bad as it is, wrenching it is not in fact a depression, because you look at the millennial attitudes toward business and toward their own expectations, and you see that it has actually not shaken the foundation of attitudes in the country, and probably that has something to do with the yawing inequality that we saw, were intensified during the Bush years. That this recession has had as wrenching as it is, has had a disproportionate effect on people at one end of the income level, but actually a relatively mild effect on people at the other end of the income level. It is not a we're all in the same boat. And it's time to reevaluate our bedrock ideas kind of moment that we understand the Great Depression to have been, and I think those comparisons are overwrought.
So Eli, what is that? Or go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and as Paul pointed out in his introductory slides, the unemployment is affecting this generation arguably more than any other, and right now they're kind of rolling with it, and they're going to school and they're doing things. But if this is a long, drawn-out period of unemployment and they don't feel change and any answer or solution to that, that's certainly a point of frustration. And it's not necessarily a liberal or conservative issue at that point. It's a who's in charge right now and why aren't they addressing my problems kind of issue.
Yeah.
So, I think just to get all the pieces on the table here, I think one other piece that we can't ignore is the previous president. And, a lot of this is sort of mischaracterized as unique attributes of the Bush administration, of the Obama campaign versus, spending 8 years with the Republican brand as seen through the lens of the Bush administration and finding it wanting in a whole bunch of ways and going somewhere else. I think that was a defining experience for a lot of us who came up during that time. But I also think, it demonstrates how quickly things can shift, that the Republican brand right now has actually managed to move itself already fairly far away from association with George Bush, even though I don't think the policies have changed significantly, but the way people see those things has.
I would just add to that it's not just about the personality of Bush. It's about the values that are at the forefront, and the slide Scott showed are the two value dimensions where this generation is the most distinct are on social values, things like homosexuality and inclusiveness, and trust and confidence in government. And in many ways, the Republican Party brand that these folks grew up with was just defined by things that were just antithetical to them. But there are other dimensions that are not that distinctive. And if the debate and the discussion shifts to a discussion about the role of business in the free market, the millennials aren't that different in that respect. Even as Scott said, we didn't show the slide, but said, even when it comes to broader debates over the social safety net, they're not necessarily that distinctive or different or liberal, so to speak. So the Democrats have some core advantages on the two dimensions that have defined debate in recent years, social issues and sort of confidence, bigger trust in government kind of issues. But if the debate moves off of those issues or those dimensions, it's not clearly that much of a Democratic advantage.
I mean, arguably, you could say that the biggest advantage in terms of underlying values that the Democrats have with respect to this generation are on the social issues, which have been completely off the radar for the past year. Yep. And so to the extent that people are updating their political predispositions based on what they're seeing out there, all the judgments being based on the perceived ineffectiveness of government in dealing with a very serious economic situation, and none of it on the social issues which were so important in the 2004 campaign and in other Republican campaigns.
And just before that gets set, it's social issues and foreign policy to some extent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's two of the three kind of.
Mm-hmm. But even if social issues are not on the front burner right now, when you get to an election and choosing between a Democratic House, a Republican House, Democratic Senate, Republican Senate this November, and you think, are there changes that could result from a Republican majority? Is that something that young people are likely to shift their focus back to social issues if they think that there's some
I don't think there's any. There doesn't appear to be any space for that to happen in terms of the the campaigns are not are not likely to be talking about them.
And part of I'm sorry.
Judy, I think the social issue thing is really. I mean, you don't want to generalize. They're always going to be there and matter in ways we can't always predict. But that really is a boomer-driven thing. That really is about. I mean, that really is about a peculiar and particular generation whose sort of anti-establishmentism and moral self-righteousness and cultural division dating back to the 1960s came to dominate American politics for a long, rather worthless moment.
Wow.
And
Ouch.
I really, yeah. So I really don't think that if we're talking about millennials here, but I really again down a sliding scale of generation, and I think Obama represents the leading edge of that. I really don't think those issues that I grew up with are going to have the potency in the political arena.
And one of the most hot
I don't think it's cyclical.
And one of the most hot button of those being abortion, which we see the millennials are, if anything, as conservative, if not a little more
for a wide
conservative.
variety of reasons, both
Right.
technological and just the evolution of social attitudes and the evolution of technology, where I think abortion is one issue where that really comes into play. There is a broader consensus among younger Americans than the sort of political parties would necessarily say there is, or then they would necessarily find they have an interest in acknowledging.
So if social issues are not going to keep the millennials connected to Democrats, what would? And again, I'm going to keep asking, what's the opening for Republicans to make headway?
I think that, when you're looking at the mix of social issues, things equilibrate, things change. So if you look at what someone who's a self-identified social conservative believes circa 2010 versus what a self-identified social conservative believes circa 1980 was very different. Ronald Reagan campaigned against incredibly onerous state initiatives, kind of banning, gay teachers from teaching in public schools. That's not on the map. 49 states permit same-sex couples to adopt children. Many people argue, including Chris Caldwell of the Weekly Standard, that that's when the gay marriage debate really ended, when you decided that gay parents are fit, quote-unquote, to raise children. And everything else is just this kind of long cultural lag that follows that. So I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think Scott raised a very astute point. When you're looking at Obama's erosion, he already was fairly weak with non-college whites. Where has his erosion been? It's been happening with college-educated white voters. It's so far been relatively gentle, but it could accelerate. And that's interesting. And if the social issues were seen as more salient, maybe that wouldn't be the truth, or maybe that wouldn't be the case. One thing that I think is very kind of important to keep in mind about how Republicans are going to position themselves, how social conservatives are going to position themselves, kind of as we go forward, is that when you're looking at this survey, 21% of millennials are married, 12% of them have children. Now, when you look at any generation, the folks who have 3 or more children are the ones who are actually shaping that generation in terms of the next generation in terms of its sensibilities and what have you. I'd love to know the 20% who are married, the 12% who have children now, that is to say, who are the ones who are getting started relatively early, what are their values like? Where are they living? What kind of communities? What are their political sensibilities? How do they feel about the prospect of inflation and a variety of other kind of threats that are raised by the right? It's an interesting thing to think about.
But they're probably not having 3 kids anymore, I can say. We might have to readjust the definition.
If we stop the home buyer's tax credit, maybe they can afford it.
And well, before we go to Michael and Scott to answer that question about, everybody get ready because I'm about to come to all of you for your question. Do you want to try to tackle what he just raised?
I mean, I have not looked at that in the new survey, but it's the case in all the surveys that married people are more conservative, more Republican-leaning than unmarried people. And for the kinds of young people who are getting married early, that pattern probably holds up. But we'll look at that.
Just to your question about how do where do Democrats hold on to these folks?
Right.
I think when you have a generation that is less attached to kind of religious institutions and religious practice, yes, they may pray, but going to church less or synagogue or whatever, they look for meaning in other places. And I think part of what made 2008 a transcendent moment was it offered a story about national meaning that resonated with this generation. Bush also offered a story about national meaning, but it didn't resonate, I would argue, with most people who are millennials. But
story
Obama,
being first African American president?
No, about rebirth and renewal, about building a stronger America, respect in the world,
Working together. That was a big part of his theme too.
Exactly, and I think that we've lost sight of that strand of the politics of meaning. So there's an intra-Democrat conversation going on right now about do you kind of scale back and do small kind of incremental bits and pieces that everybody can like, or do you cast this large vision? I'd argue to keep these people at least, you have to have some sense of kind of we are a country that is working in the world, building a green economy, addressing the ills that are happening elsewhere, and that's what this brand is about. I think if you lose that thread of meaning, people will go elsewhere for it.
So green economy and staying engaged in the world.
Green economies, and a foreign policy that reflects our values. But I'm deliberately not saying it's not issues. That's the point is people always want to break it down into issues. It's a vision, and it's a sense of where we're headed as a society that we're all participating in. that I think is missing, and that George Bush, although I disagreed with it, if you look at his second inaugural speech, definitely there was a vision there that people could relate to.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry.
Yeah. All right, raise your hand. Get ready to call. I'll call.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
Just to both respond to Rand's point and slightly correct it. 21% of this age group is married.
Paul.
21% of this age group is married. 34% of this age group are parents. 12% of this age group are married with children living in their household.
That's an incredibly useful and interesting point, because it also speaks to some of this incredible kind of class stratification when you're looking at family structure.
And then to your additional question, so what does that mean in terms of political values? I haven't looked at it all the way through, but I'm fairly confident in saying the 12% who are married and living with their children tend to be more traditional and more conservative across a range of political and social issues, as one might expect.